Oh, yes, I saw your name. Yes, I saw your name.
Nice to meet you. I go by either, so whatever's simplest.
Where are you from?
Originally from Quebec City, but now I live in Ottawa.
I'm from Toronto. From Japan.
Originally from
So,
Where would you like me to sit?
wherever you sit next to that stuff. Is that okay?
What the last one?
Bien.
Sorry. So Hatim is on. He can hear us, okay? We're going to put him on after the presentations. There's going to be a video. And just as soon as all the presentations are done, let us know. We'll make it so he can talk as well.
Yeah. So are we going to? So you don't?
Oh,
he
you want?
won't. He won't be on for the question and answer.
Which would he's on for as long as for the whole thing. He wants to listen to the whole thing. Do you want to do Q&A right after?
Well, we thought
or-
maybe a little bit, maybe a
Like
short
s-
Q&A
and then
after
save
each-
some more. That's a good idea.
Okay.
We'll do that. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Bien. Yeah.
I was going to say something.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
If that's, and then we can do the introduction. Okay, if we could get people taking their seats, that would be good, so we could begin the final session. That's going to be chaired by Dr. Barbara Birkett, a former president of Physicians for Global Survival, and a board member or executive member of CPREP, a dermatologist from not too far away from here. So, how are people finding today? Yeah. Good enough energy. We started off with a plenary and now we're going back to another plenary. And outside of that, sandwiching this are cultural performances, and hopefully many of you will be around for the evening, and I think that most of you are going to be there for the dinner, which should be great. Just to remind you, the dinner is included for full registrants and for student registrants, so and not included for a single day today registrant who is not a student. Well, actually, there is no single day for students. So, anyway, it's included for almost all of you, I think. But if you had any questions, you can ask Andrea. The morning symposia was a bit challenging in some ways because we had somewhere a presenter couldn't show up because of a visa issue getting into Canada that we didn't know about, and we had a facilitator who was busy doing something else. So, but you guys managed really well, and I think that we work well as a community. So thank you for putting up with the little hiccups that we have here. I think that our website in terms of the evaluations isn't really working because we're trying to find a way of putting it for single sessions really easily, and I don't think we're going to be able to do that. So please do your paper evaluations. That's very important for our accreditation type issues. So, and then again, continuing education credits you can get at the desk. Are there any other housekeeping issues that people have? We will, after this should finish around 5. Rachel has to leave very quickly after. We've got more or less a break from 5 till 6, and we have to vacate this room during that time because they have to set things up here. After 6 o'clock, we will have the book signing with Ziauddin outside there, and people from the local chapters are coming over here. Then we have our dance performance beginning right after 6:30. So people should come back into the room for 6:30. There's also a Meet Physicians for Global Survival meeting starting at 6 that is in your program. So I think those are the things. The dinner is supposed to begin at 7. Our speaker will probably be speaking sometime around dessert time. And I think you'll be really impressed if you're going to be there. So anyway, thank you and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Bienvenue tout le monde. Il me ferait grand plaisir d'annoncer que nous entendrons cet après-midi 3 personnes qui ont travaillé si fort et avec beaucoup d'intelligence pour la paix au Canada et en beaucoup d'autres pays. They will each spend about 20 minutes, and we will have question and answer time. And I will plan to introduce them individually, but I want to make one announcement about Dr. Hatim Kannaneh, who is coming to us via modern technology from Israel. So he will be listening in, and he will participate in the question and answer between speeches as well. And then we will have his recorded presentation as the third one. Our first speaker will be Setsuko Thurlow. Setsuko was a young schoolgirl on August 6th, 1945, when the atom bomb landed on Hiroshima, and she will no doubt refer to that horrendous day. She subsequently attended university in Japan, Lynchburg College in Virginia. She married a Canadian, then obtained a Master of Social Work at University of Toronto. She actively practiced her social work profession in various venues in the Toronto area, including the District School Board. And she helped develop curriculum for social work in a multicultural society. She has dedicated her life to the mission of abolishing nuclear weapons. And some of us have been privileged to work with her on the Toronto Hiroshima Day Coalition. She has spoken at the UN General Assembly First Committee. She is a member of the Order of Canada. She recently spoke eloquently at a conference of 146 nations in Nayarit, Mexico, on the catastrophic harm of nuclear weapons, and subsequently was invited by the government of Ireland to address the people of that country. I will now let you have the privilege of listening to Setsuko.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I'm very happy to be with you here today at this very important conference. And I'm quite impressed by the broad diversity of conference participants' life experiences and their expertise. And yet, we are here today, and yesterday, and today, and tomorrow, because of our shared common purpose, the goal of increasing our knowledge and skill in an attempt to improve the human condition wherever we may serve in this global community. We are deeply concerned about the world in which we live, and we want to change it. for the better. We have a huge challenge to respond to, but I'm sure all of us here, each one of us are here, are making that contribution and making the difference. As a survivor of Hiroshima, I have spent most of my life as an advocate for disarmament and educator, and as well as practicing in my chosen profession of social work. I have attempted to put the human face to the abstract discussion of nuclear weapons so that people can have more intimate knowledge, understanding of the problem, nuclear issues. So in order to do that, I have often shared my personal testimony, and I am willing to do that to some extent today. On that fateful day of August 6, 1945, as a 13-year-old grade 8 student and a member of the student mobilization program, I was at the Army headquarters, 1.8 kilometers from ground zero. About 30 of our students were assigned to work as a decoding assistant of secret messages. At 8:15 a.m., the Major Yanai was giving us a pep talk at the assembly. Then suddenly, I saw in the window a blinding bluish-white flash. And I remember having the sensation of floating in the air. As I regained consciousness in the total darkness and silence, I found myself pinned by the collapsed building. I could not move, and I knew I was faced with death. I began to hear my classmates' faint voice cries, "Mother, help me. God, help me." Then suddenly I felt somebody's hands pushing my left shoulder and heard the man saying, "Don't give up. Keep moving, keep pushing. I'm trying to free you. See the light coming through the opening. Crawl toward it as quickly as possible." As I crawled out, the ruins were already on fire. That meant most of my classmates, about 30 of the girls who were with me in the same room, were burned to death alive. A soldier ordered me and 2 other girls, surviving girls, to escape to the nearby hills. Outside, I looked around. Although it was morning, the detonation took place at 8:15 in the morning, but it was dark as twilight because of the dust and smoke and soot rising up in the air. I saw streams of ghostly figures slowly shuffling from the center part of the city to the nearby hills. They did not look like human beings. Their hair stood straight up, and they were naked and tattered, bleeding, burned, blackened, and swollen. Parts of their bodies were missing, flesh and skin hanging from the bones, some with their eyeballs hanging in their hands, and some with their stomach burst open, their intestines hanging out. We students joined the ghostly procession carefully stepping over the dead and dying. There was a deathly silence, broken only by the moans of the injured and their pleas for water. The foul stench of burned skin filled the air. We managed to escape to the foot of the hill, where there was an army training ground about the size of 2 football fields. It was covered with the dead and injured, who were desperately begging, often in faint whispers, "Water, water, please, please give me water." But we had no containers to carry water. We went to a nearby stream to wash off the blood and dirt from our bodies. Then we tore off our blouses, soaked them with water, and hurried back to hold them to the mouths of the injured, who desperately sucked in the moisture. We did not see any doctors or nurses all day. When darkness fell, we sat on the hillside and all night watched the entire city burn, numbed by the massive, grotesque scale of death and suffering we had witnessed. My father left town early that morning. My mother was rescued from under the collapsed home. My sister and her 4-year-old son, who were on their way to the doctor's office, were burned beyond recognition and survived for a few days. An aunt and 2 cousins were found as skeletons. My sister-in-law is still missing. We rejoice the survival of my uncle and his wife, but about 10 days later, both of them died with purple spots all over their bodies, and their internal organs seemed to have liquefied. My own age group of over 8,000 grade 7 and 8 students from all the high schools of the city were engaged in the task of clearing the fire lane in the central part of the city. Many of them were killed instantly by the heat of 4,000 degrees Celsius. Many were simply carbonized and vaporized. I should say, or vaporized. Radiation, the unique characteristic of the atomic bombing, affected people in mysterious and random ways, with some dying instantly and others weeks and months or even years later by the delayed effects. And radiation is still killing survivors today, 69 years later. Thus, my beloved city of Hiroshima suddenly became desolation, with heaps of ash and rubble, skeletons and blackened corpses. Out of the population of 360,000, most of whom were non-combatant, women, children, and elderly, became victims of indiscriminate massacre of the atomic bombing. By the end of 1945, some 140,000 people had perished. As of now, at least 260,000 have perished in Hiroshima alone from the effects of blast, heat, and radiation. As I use the numbers of the dead, it pains me deeply. Reducing the dead to numbers trivializes their precious lives and negates their human dignity. Not only did people have to endure the physical devastation of near starvation, homelessness, lack of medical care, rapidly spreading social discrimination against survivors as contaminated one by nuclear poison. Total lack of service by the Japanese government, the collapse of authoritarian militaristic social system, and the sudden introduction to a democratic way of life. But also they suffered from psychosocial control by the Allied forces occupation authorities following Japan's surrender. The occupation authorities established the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the sole purpose of this commission was to study the effects of radiation from the bomb on human beings, and not to provide any treatment to the injured. Needless to say, the survivors felt treated as guinea pigs, not once, but twice. First as the targets of the atomic bombing, and then as a subject of medical research. The occupation authorities also censored media coverage of survivors' suffering and confiscated their diaries, literary writings, films, photographs, scrapbooks, medical records, and so forth, 32,000 items in all. The triumphant scientific and technological achievement in making atomic bomb could freely be written, but the human suffering inflicted by the atomic bomb was not to be heard by the world. Following the massive trauma of bombing, survivors had to repress themselves in silence and isolation, and were thus deprived of the normal process of grieving. After the end of the 7-year occupation, a flood of information suddenly and for the first time became available, enabling the survivors to contemplate the meaning of our survival in historical perspective and global context. With time and support, many survivors were able to transcend their personal tragedies and reach the state to recognize the need for cultural transformation away from violence and war. We became convinced that no human beings should ever have to repeat our experience of the inhumanity, illegality, immorality, and cruelty of atomic bombs, and that our mission was to warn the world about the threat of the ultimate evil. We believe that humanity and nuclear weapons cannot coexist, and it is our moral imperative to abolish nuclear weapons in order to secure a safe, clean, and just world for future generations. With this conviction, we have been speaking out around the world for the past several decades for the total abolition of nuclear weapons. Yet, as we examine the current reality of nuclear disarmament, We Hibakushas, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, are dismayed and disturbed at the lack of tangible progress toward that goal. We see the nuclear weapon states' obvious lack of political will for nuclear disarmament, demonstrated by the non-ratification of Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, non-compliance with Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the 17-year deadlock in the Conference on Disarmament, the failure to negotiate a nuclear weapon-free zone in Middle East, the continued modernization of nuclear weapons, and so forth. This is a totally unacceptable reality. They have kept the world as a hostage in fear and anxiety, while squandering trillions of dollars away from meeting human needs in order to build ever more destructive weapons of mass destruction. The nuclear status is intolerable. In contrast to the gloomy perspective of reality, I would like to share with you the exceedingly empowering conference I attended in Mexico in February this year. I attended the second international conference on humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, hosted by the government of Mexico, attended by 146 states and 120 NGOs and civil society organizations. In addition to Mexico, the government of Norway, which held the inaugural conference a year ago, and Austria, which will host the third conference in this coming December, along with ICANN, International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, and other civil society organizations have helped to transform the discourse about nuclear weapons and have put a renewed focus where it belongs, on humanity's well-being and survival. This represents breakaway from the traditional state-centric perspective, which mainly has discussed and considered nuclear weapons purely in terms of geopolitics, strategic balance, and deterrence. By shifting the focus away from the theoretical abstraction of classic deterrence theory and toward the actual impact and consequences of the use of nuclear weapons, their very legitimacy is being seriously challenged. We heard one national delegation after another, their impassioned and well-reasoned demand and a statement for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. Their voices indicated that their frustration with the non-productive process of the current NPT regime manipulated by nuclear weapon states and their desire to move forward toward outlawing nuclear weapons. Like other weapons of mass destruction, such as biological and chemical weapons, cluster munitions, and anti-personnel landmines have been banned. Except for a few allies of the nuclear weapon states, such as Australia, Canada, Germany, the Netherlands, and Turkey, the majority called for a ban on nuclear weapons. At the conclusion of the conference, with a heightened sense of excitement and determination, the participants welcomed the summary report by the chair of the conference, the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. He called for the establishment of new international norms and standards through legally binding instruments to ban nuclear weapons. The time has come, he argued, for a diplomatic process to be initiated to this goal, and within a specific time frame to be concluded by the 70th anniversary of bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By the way, that would be August next year. This conference proved that the coordinating organization, ICAN's outstanding ability to recruit energetic younger generation into the movement, develop effective partnership with 350 international NGOs, as well as with the governments, and organize 7 conferences around the world: Norway, Mexico, Costa Rica, Ireland, Turkey, and Sweden, and Austria, within 22 months, solely for the purpose of prohibiting and eliminating nuclear weapons. I know time is up, but one more thing I would like to add. Last Thursday, April 24th, we learned that the Republic of Marshall Islands decided to take an unprecedented legal action against 9 nuclear weapon states for violating the legal obligation to disarm and, quote, flagrant denial of human dignity, unquote. It argues it is justified in taking this action because of the harm it had suffered as a result of 67 US nuclear tests from 1946 to 1958, and that the equivalent of 1.6 Hiroshima bomb detonated daily for 12 years. What crime man commit against man? Such nuclear tests have been carried out at more than 60 locations around the globe, often on the land of indigenous and minority people, far away from those who make decisions to conduct them. It's about time the hidden suffering of Marshall Islanders be made public, and those responsible must be held accountable in the International Court of Justice in The Hague. This bold and courageous action is called Nuclear Zero Lawsuit, and it's supported by powerful legal experts of international NGOs. I haven't finished this, but I think I used the time. I will quit. But I thought, by listening to my story, I'm sure in your mind you have lots of issues you want to think about, discuss, and take action for. And that action urgently needed. People who are already in the peace movement, who are not yet, I think this is the fate of humanity. We all have to work together now. Thank you.
Setsuko, as usual, has wowed us all. I'm going to suggest that we perhaps take one or two short questions now, and then we will have our next speaker, and that will give you some time to cogitate on what you've just heard. So if anybody has any immediate questions, particularly what they themselves might do, Michael.
Thanks for that amazing presentation. It's probably the third time I've heard you speak, and each time it becomes more powerful. It's more of a statement. The mythology that the dropping of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs was necessary to stop the war, to curtail World War II and save millions of American lives is a myth and should be included somehow in your profound statements, because people say, well, it was necessary to end the war and Japanese people were the enemy.
I'm afraid I'm not hearing you.
He's saying that it's been justified as the Hiroshima bombing was justified as necessary to end the war when
It
this was
wasn't.
which
Okay.
and
Maybe
be
you could respond to
emphasized.
that, actually, as opposed to my stating
Oh, I
it.
see. Okay.
Perhaps you could say why it's not true.
Good suggestion. Okay.
Do you want to explain why it wasn't true? Do you want to explain why it wasn't true?
And the use of the bomb on Hiroshima was necessary? Is that the argument?
Why it wasn't? Yeah. Why you know that's not true?
Well, because Japan was already finished. I was there. I lived in that country. We suffered together. We were practically starving. And soldiers didn't have decent weapons because by that time, United States was successful to sink most of the battleships or transport ships, which carried a supply and munitions to the southern islands where the Japanese soldiers are supposedly fighting. But those ships are gone, so Japan lost the means to feed them. So I understand many millions of Japanese soldiers died from starvation rather than fighting in the South Pacific. It was that state. And then when the United States captured islands of Tinian and so forth in the South Pacific, they developed airports, and they started the indiscriminate bombing of about 70% of the cities in Japan. Well, that was the situation Japan was. It was totally incapable of continuing to start war, and government had been studying how to stop. So Mr. Truman knew Japan was already finished, but still went ahead and used it because Mr. Groves, or the General Groves, was very anxious to see their products be tested. Anyway, it's a long, complex story, all right, but it's clear. It was not necessary to use. It was for political reason it was used, not for military reason.
Exactly. In fact,
you know about that, right?
It was there to show Stalin that the Americans had the bomb and that they shouldn't continue in their communist spread through Europe and other places. It was a message to the world that they were the superpower and the Soviets were not.
Thank you.
Warren?
Setsuko, I wonder if you could comment on the fact that Canada has officially signed on to the international treaty about cluster munitions, but has done so in a way, cluster munitions, cluster bombs,
Yeah.
Canada has signed on to the international treaty, but in such a way that is actually possible for our country to use cluster munitions if any of our allies decide that it's a good idea. So in fact, it's not really an agreement to not use cluster weapons. I wonder if you'd comment on that from your point of view.
Well, all I can say is that doesn't surprise me. There are many other issues which are in the similar condition.
Do you have any other questions at the moment? There are thousands of them, I know, but I think we'll let you think about them, and I'm now going to introduce our next speaker. Some of you have already heard her this afternoon, and you're in for another treat. Rachel Thibeault comes to us as professor in the occupational therapy program at the University of Ottawa. She has degrees in occupational therapy and philosophy, community philosophy from the Université de Montréal, and a PhD from the University of Montréal in community psychology. She specializes in community rehabilitation and issues of meaning, resilience, and social justice in healthcare. Her participatory action research with vulnerable communities has taken her to the High Arctic, to Southeast Asia, to Central America, to Africa, to the Middle East. She brings a participative perspective that fosters community decision-making at all levels and promotes approaches that use the principles of sustainable livelihoods, service integration, and inclusiveness. Her talk will be about building resilient communities. Rachel?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank Setsuko for her presentation. I have to say, I find it difficult to follow after you. It was a very moving and informative talk. Thanks a lot. I've had some dealings with war, but certainly nothing like what you've experienced. And what I'm going to be talking about is social healing with community-based rehabilitation. Do I have the control for the slides? Or, yeah.
Green is go.
Green is go. I'm not good with technology, but I should be able to manage that. I just wanted to mention I've been involved in work in several conflict and post-conflict areas. Be it in Lebanon, we were talking about cluster bombs. I've worked a lot in Laos with landmine victims, in Nicaragua, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Iraq. So in many places, I've seen societies destroyed either by disaster or war. And one of the key issues is how to not only rebuild the society, but trying to rebuild a peaceful society. How do you go from a society where hatred is still tangible after a war to one where peace can blossom, even if just a little initially? When I started out in the field, I felt I didn't have the tools, I didn't know how to approach that whole issue of hatred in the communities where I was working. And I turned to a man in a book. The man's called Amin Malouf. I don't know if any of you know him. He's a Lebanese sociologist. He now lives in France. And he's worked quite extensively on identity. And he's written a book. It's interesting. You will see the title is very different in French and in English. In French, the book is called Les Identités Meurtrières, the Murderous Identities. And it was translated in English as In the Name of Identity, Violence and the Need to Belong. I liked actually the French titles better because in his book and in most of his works, he speaks quite clearly about the fact that we have a choice. We all have multiple identities. And at very crucial points in life, we have to decide which ones of those identities we're going to cultivate. And so the people I've been working with and the communities I've been working with have chosen to do work along the lines of identity. So the working on identity, what we wanted to do was really to create a context conducive to peace after or even during a war. And over the years, we ended up with not a blueprint, but I would say some indications of what can be done to really help a community rebuild and rebuild along peaceful lines. The first thing we wanted to do was to create new social models. And because I worked in community-based rehabilitation, so my field, I'm an occupational therapist, and when I work in a disaster or in a conflict area, it's clear that my mandate is to work with people with disabilities. So these are the people I have access to. And so we designed the whole process around people with disabilities. And so we decided to see if, with the people with disabilities, we could create new social models in order to rebuild a better civil society. And the steps that have emerged over time are fairly, again, we haven't invented anything, but we've really drawn from a lot of the local wisdom. What happens, obviously, in a war zone is that enemies or ex-enemies do not want to come into contact. They will avoid each other as much as they can. And so it's very difficult to rebuild any kind of peace if the antagonists don't want, the protagonists don't want to go and speak to each other. With disabilities, we have a bit of an edge. Often you have only one place to go for services. So people from both camps have to show up if they want services. And so it gives us a bit of an edge. Again, with the general population, we can't force people into the same setting. With people who have been disabled through the war, yes, sometimes there's one stop for getting services, so they have to come into contact. So through some of the services, we can create proximity. The second step is really using suffering as the great equalizer. A key issue in Malouf's works is that we have the choice, again, to look at a situation as being totally detached from it. I can, for example, listening to Setsuko talk, I could choose to look at it with a very detached lens, feeling, oh, I'm not Japanese, it's got nothing to do with me. I use my foreigner identity to create a distance. Or I can see, no, Setsuko is speaking about something that's global, about something that's universal, and she appeals to a common identity, our human identity. And suddenly, if I relate to Setsuko and her story with my human identity, the identity we share, the collective one, I can feel the suffering, I can empathize, and suddenly it gives me a totally different lens, and it puts me in a different psychological posture, one where compassion and solidarity are much more likely to arise. The third step is using that common identity, the one we choose to cultivate together, to transcend our differences. Yes, there are differences, but maybe the differences are not the main issues between us. Maybe the differences are really minor. We have way more in common than we might think initially. And finally, we have to give shape to that common identity in visible, tangible actions, not just make it some kind of a discourse. And I just want to make an aside here. What we've chosen to do with CBR is quite different from what's being done with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions rely mostly on dialogue, and I'm not saying it's something bad, far from it, it's an excellent start, but we realize now over time that dialogue is not enough. We really have to give shape to that collective identity in a way that's visible and creates models. And so, through that giving shape in daily activities, we offer new social models, and finally, we have to educate, use those models to educate for peace. And I know this may seem very abstract, so I really wanted to give you some examples of how this all works in practice. So I'm taking you to Nicaragua after the war. And one of the first steps, when I was working with an American agency called Polis, and when we started working on the first programs with people with disabilities, our first step was try to find local leaders. Again, we rely only on local leaders and local competence. Local leaders who wanted to be a voice for peace. People who had already kind of processed that whole war issue and identity, and who really wanted to rebuild civil society on a new ground. And so there's one that I identify here, a friend and colleague, Emmanuel, an ex-Sandinista fighter who lost both arms to torture during the war. And despite his history, really wanted to build bridges between the ex-Contras and the ex-Sandinistas, because as he said, in his own words, it's the only future possible for the country. We have to bridge the divide. So once we identify people with disabilities who have this potential and this will to change things, they really become the local agents of social change. So with Emmanuel, we did all kinds of community consultations and asked them, how do you think we should start the process? And Emmanuel said after the consultation, well, what we really need is a local clinic for rehabilitation. We need to provide the civilians, the ex-combatants, with means to really resume more productive lives. So we did. So we created, they're not in, so yes, you have a picture of some, this is one of an ex-combatant who lost a leg to a landmine. And most people would be, again, the hatred was still palpable in that city, and people would avoid each other from the different groups. So we did create a rehab clinic, Walking Unidos, and that clinic was open to all people with disabilities. And again, because services were so rare, suddenly we had Contras and Sandinistas coming to seek services. And we did something very systematic, and it was absolutely planned. We started giving appointments to men from both groups at the same time. We wanted to, again, create that proximity, make sure they were in the waiting room at the same time. And we had some backups in case violence would break out. But things went fairly fine, but it was quite striking to see. Initially, both groups would go at opposite corners of the room. They would sit there, and you could see that the identity that prevailed was the identity of ex-combatants. In the other corner was the enemy. The second step was to make them wait. And what I often do, because again, you don't want to create local backlash, I always play the dumb foreigner, because they would ask, no, who's the silly person who arranged the schedule like this? It's me. I can take the backlash. I'm not going to be staying in the community. So blame, the silly lady coming from Canada. And but we wanted to have them wait so that each group could listen to the conversations taking place in the other group. And what happened, gradually they realized they were talking about the very same things. They were all men who could no longer feed their families. And as they were talking, it was quite fascinating. We could see over time that even physically the groups would kind of sit closer to each other, and they were gradually transcending their identity as ex-combatants and were seeing each other as men who had been disabled and were experiencing the same hardship. They could no longer feed their families. So when we picked up that some of the men seemed to be less aggressive towards the other group, let's say it was time to put them at the parallel bars, we put them together. We increased physical closeness, so they had to share rehab equipment, they had to be really close to each other. And when things seemed to be going right, that's when really that was the clincher of sorts. We took them aside and said, well, we've got a deal for you. If you agree to start up a micro-business together, one ex-Sandinista and one Contra, you get a grant, you get a loan, you get a special micro-business loan. But if you agree to work together and in a way that's visible, not somewhere in a basement, but in a fairly open way. And so what we started to create was, for example, what you see in that boat. For me, it's a picture that means a lot. To your left, it's Salvador, an ex-Contra who lost a leg on a landmine. To the right, it's Alejandro, an ex-Sandinista who lost both arms to torture. And both men agreed to start up a fishing business, literally in the same boat, for everybody to see. And what's been fascinating to observe, it's really the people with disabilities who started creating models of peaceful interactions in that society. Nobody else, the fully abled population, wasn't ready to go there yet. But people with disabilities were the first new social models that emerged after the war. And so we really tried to multiply those social models and make sure that we would create conditions where even friendships would develop. So with the grant, they also got a special grant so that maybe they could have housing next to each other, so that their children would play together, because the ultimate goal is to really erase the scars from the war. And it may take a generation or two, but if the kids are raised together, we're going one step in the right direction. So this is one example of what's been happening, how we've been using CBR to kind of heal some of the war wounds. And the same thing happened in Sierra Leone. In Sierra Leone, they've tried truth and reconciliation commissions, and in many instances, it failed. It failed miserably because of the depth of the atrocities that had been committed. And in CBR programs, what we've been doing was actually, again, to put people in proximity, to tell people, well, people with disabilities, we're going to give you some form of employment if you agree, for example, to rebuild the local clinic, but together with people from both camps. And initially, what you feel is dreadful silence. You go on the work site, people won't talk to each other. Again, hatred is palpable. But over time, they have to start asking, so, who's got the hammer? Where did you put the nails? Very menial stuff. But again, it's a forced proximity that eventually creates a space for dialogue. So in Sierra Leone, gradually, some communities got rebuilt around those traditions. And again, always around common suffering. We spoke a lot about the suffering in the war. In Iraq and in Lebanon, again, we talked about suffering as the great equalizer. People would come around the table with their religious labels or their ethnic labels and being fairly aggressive towards each other. And yet, when we started looking at disability, for example, in Iraq, when the question was asked, who's the most vulnerable group that we would like us to work with? And the answer was the war widows. The second step was to ask people from all the different ethnic and religious groups to tell us stories about their war widows, the war widows from their groups. And suddenly, the universal suffering started to resonate. And over time, we could see again people transcending the divisive identities and really collaborating around one single identity, that of war survivors, of people who wanted to rebuild civil society and who all had people who suffered within their immediate family. In Lebanon, a little bit the same thing. We asked parents from often, I would say, opposite backgrounds to act together to do some advocacy to get services for their children with disabilities. So, for example, children were maimed by landmines in Lebanon. We may ask a Shiite father, a Sunnite father, Sunni father, to say, okay, you're going to advocate together so that your kids get services. And so through these CBR programs and the new social models created with people with disabilities, gradually we have managed to shift the hatred into a better civil society. And I just want to end on the quotation from Eric Fromm, who always said that educating is really fine, but unless you actually give it a physical shape, you will go nowhere. You really have to make sure that you create very visible examples of what you're trying to convey as a message. Thank you.
Okay, that was wonderful. Thank you. A couple of short questions now, and then I think we'll go on to our third speaker. But do any of you have? Here's a question now.
Question for Rachel. I can see that probably one of the biggest obstacles to bring together and work in harmony for the two sides is a sense of affront that they are being, that their hurt, their pain, their loss is being invalidated. How do you gauge when the time is opportune to get to working together?
It's, in many ways, as I mentioned, we watch people, like with the men in Nicaragua, we watched when they started getting closer, because you want to be very careful not to make vulnerable people even more vulnerable than they are. And you have to make sure that they kind of initiate this process. Like also in Sierra Leone with the rebuilding together, people had the choice to be at different ends of the work site, so we wouldn't force them. But if they gradually started getting closer, according to their level of comfort, that's when we would try to discuss about greater closeness. And in Sierra Leone, it was interesting because what you're bring up, some people requested that to be able to work with the other group, they wanted to have some rituals around forgiveness, asking forgiveness and giving forgiveness. So we've embedded some of those rituals in the whole process. But always the principle, if you don't see any signs of rapprochement, you won't push it. Defense mechanisms have their reason for being there, and you don't tear down anything unless there's something else to take its place.
Rachel, my name's Ryan. I'm a medical student at University of Vermont. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a couple quick questions for you. One, regarding bringing two different groups together, talking about the Contras and the Sandinistas, is there any work that you do to protect the individuals, say a Sandinista is reaching out to a Contra, to protect him from any backlash that may come from his own community when he's reaching out? And then two, have you seen other identities in addition to disabilities that could bridge the gap between individuals from conflicting groups?
I'll answer the first question. The second one, I will ask you to maybe explain it a bit better. In terms of the backlash, we are really, really careful. I always work with cultural brokers, and before doing anything, we do what's called an analysis of the power differential. We really want to make sure that we know the power structure of the group, and so if there's a possibility of backlash, we will not go there. So, and it's really something that's discussed openly. Once you've established the power structure, you will meet with the different groups separately. And it's really the local people themselves who really gauge the risk of doing that kind of rapprochement. But we really make that analysis beforehand. And I'm not sure what you meant by the second question.
By the second question, what I was referring to is the common suffering that these individuals that have disabilities is something, it's a common ground, it's a common identity that you were speaking about. Have you found other common identities in addition to disability or profound suffering that will bring people together in the same way that you can do with CBR?
Yes, actually, what I've seen, even if it wasn't people with disabilities, I look at AIDS orphans I've been working with in Africa. Obviously, they don't necessarily have a disability, physical or psychological, but their sufferings really created a solidarity and a desire to be together. And even in conflict and post-conflict areas, sometimes the simple fact to have gone through war together, even on different sides, it's enough to bring that solidarity. And that's why when I use Malouf's work, it's always looking, we kind of list all the different identities, and some have to do with disabilities, but some go beyond that as well. And we will try to nurture all the collective identities.
I'm going to ask you to save any further questions because I think we should get our third speaker first and then hang on to those ideas and we can ask Mitchell later. By the wonders of modern technology, we will now hear the voice of Dr. Hatim Kannaneh from Israel. He received his training in South Dakota and the University of Hawaii, the Harvard Medical School, and he got a master's in public health at the Harvard School of Public Health. In 1970, he returned to his home village in Galilee, where he was the first and only resident doctor for 50,000 Palestinian civilians of Israel. He also worked as the sub-district physician heading the region's government health office. He established the Galilee Society for Health Research and Services, which spawned other major Arab NGOs in Israel, which helped to address special community health issues. In retirement, he has written a memoir, A Doctor in Galilee, The Life and Struggle of Palestinians in Israel. He's also written short stories and is working on a trilogy of novels. And today he's going to talk to us about a disadvantaged minority in a developed country, which I'm sure has lessons for this country, and also the significance of inequalities in infant mortality. So can we hear now from Dr. Kannaneh, who I also believe is listening in from Israel.
Okay. Health and politics, the case of the Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. First, thank you for affording me this opportunity to speak to you. Let me first introduce you to my study population. It is the part of the indigenous Palestinian population who in 1948 became citizens of the State of Israel shortly after it was established. Around that time, some 85% Palestinian residents of what was to become Israel were forced to cross the borders and become refugees in neighboring countries, while we, the remaining 15%, were crossed by a border, so to speak, to become Israeli citizens through no choice of ours. We now make up over 20% of the total population of Israel, a sizable minority. In the Nakba of 1948, the catastrophe, we call it, nearly a third of this group, of the group that stayed as citizens of Israel, were internally displaced to become internal refugees, and Israel calls them as present absentees, thus losing their right to their homes and private property, including their land and any bank accounts. The remaining two-thirds lost most of their land to confiscation by a state that defined us for all practical purposes out of its civic domain and the emerging concept of public good. The great majority of Israeli citizens reside in communities segregated by race, Arabs versus Jews. For the first 2 decades after the Nakba, Palestinian communities were placed under a draconian military rule that controlled our every movement, controlled our access to work and to education and to health facilities. When that ended in 1966, we were left in the grip of the secret apparatus, the Shin Bet, which continues till the present to manipulate our lives, especially the fate of our youth. Now let's look at some of the health determinants as they apply to our community. If you look at table number 1, it's entitled Selected Indicators of Inequality. The figures relate especially to 2 of the 3 classic independent determinants of infant mortality rate, the health indicator at the heart of this paper. The figures there in table number 1 relate to income and education, essentially. The third component, which is the environment that affects the level of infant mortality rates, the classical 3 components. That one I will not relate to here, but if time permits, maybe we can get back to it. I want here to call your attention to one subtle set of figures that inadvertently reveals the discriminatory role played directly by the state in the welfare and hence in the health of the 2 communities under consideration, Arabs in Israel and Jews in Israel. These are the figures about the percentage of families in each group that were poor before and then after the state's intervention in the form of tax and support and welfare payments. Notice then the percent of poor families that were aided by government intervention to escape poverty and rise above the statistically defined poverty line. You will see that only 8% of the Arab families and 49% of the Jewish families, originally poor, were rescued out of poverty by the state's intervention. And that's for the year 2012. And it's similar in other years as well. So let's now shift to the main subject of my talk, the infant mortality rate. The group I am addressing, of course, is not in need of introduction to infant mortality rate as the best single measure of a community's health and total well-being. So table number 2 lists the infant mortality rate for the various religious groups in Israel over time. Muslims are 84% of the total Arab population of Israel, the total citizens of Israel who are of Palestinian Arab origin. In graph number 1, I show the standard presentation of the infant mortality rate figures for Jews and for Muslims, who are the majority of the Arabs in Israel. When Israeli officials present this kind of graph in international fora, they proudly take credit for the fact that the infant mortality rate figures for our Palestinians, as Israelis are likely to say, are better than those of any Arab country, and especially better than the infant mortality rate of other Palestinian groups. This gloss on the data is misguided given my right to equal resources and equal treatment under the law. We are Israeli citizens since day one. We pay taxes in Israel and not in Egypt or Jordan. For me to accept any standard of comparison, other than the highest attainable standard by any group in my country of citizenship, is to betray the basic principles of both the public health profession and human rights that I aspire to. Israeli officials also point to the significant and continuing decline in both groups, that's Jewish and Arab, infant mortality rates, and the narrowing of the gap in absolute terms between the figures for the two groups over time. On the face of it, this is an impressive feat indeed. However, seen through the lens of equality and justice, which I argue is essential for me, these same data suggest something different altogether. The last column in table number 2, that of the relative ratio of the infant mortality rate, infant mortality rate for Muslims to the infant mortality rate for Jews, that relative ratio is also shown in graph number 2. Notice that it hovers around the figure 2 for the first half century of Israel's existence. Needless to say, in an idealistic situation, the number should be 1, of course. Now, let's look at some of the questions that I would like to raise out because of these statistics. From the critical perspective of equality, the first question to be asked is, why should there be a gap between the two population groups in the first place in terms of infant mortality rates? Remember, nearly half of the constituent Jewish population of Israel arrived from the countries of the Middle East and North Africa with socio-cultural attributes and health situations not unlike those of the Palestinians, if not worse. The difference is that the state backed by the world Jewish community, of course, invested massive funds and efforts in well-coordinated programs for the socio-economic betterment of this group. As for the Palestinian minority in Israel, not only that there were no parallel programs for them, but also that their agrarian communal infrastructure was systematically destroyed with massive land confiscations and limitations on crop selection and marketing and on irrigation schemes for the benefit of Jewish cooperative farms, the famous kibbutzim and moshavim. As the Oriental Jews, the Sephardim in Israel, were corralled into Ashkenazi cultural hegemony, members of the Palestinian Arab community in Israel were further marginalized to become day laborers in construction and agriculture in Jewish cities and new settlements. Palestinian communities lost their agriculture base while being locked out of development such as industry and commerce. Their image as a peripheral enemy locale added to their isolation. They became bedroom communities to which men returned nights and weekends. This was the actualization of Zionist dreams of using the Palestinians as hewers of wood and carriers of water, as the Prime Minister's advisor on Arab affairs once recommended. The effect of the effect of the marginalization process on health and hence on the infant mortality rate was predictable, actually. The difference between Arab and Jewish infant mortality rates became part of Israel's accepted reality and part of the system's standard of reference. Hence, when the Ministry of Health experts in the 1980s devised a special project to track down and deal with specific preventable excess infant deaths, the cutoff point for selecting participating Arab towns and villages was set at twice that for Jewish ones, an infant mortality rate of 20 for the Arabs versus 10 for the Jews. In considering the infant mortality rate of the two groups from a perspective of equality, the second prominent feature to notice, other than the existence of this 2-to-1 relative ratio most of the time, is its significant rise since the turn of the present century, to where it now stands at 2.6. My own explanation for this, and I hope that you will consider that, for this unexpected graphic turn of events is that it comes on the heels of a major and continuing rightward shift in Israel's political views to the disadvantage of the Palestinian minority. The essence of this ultra-rightist shift is a change of conception among the majority of Jewish Israelis from that of the classic Zionist colonialist framework to the open fascism of the current political leadership. With that, I will end, and I'll be happy to answer any questions for you. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Dr. Kannaneh. I should mention that I think it was hard to project a couple of the original tables in his talk, and they will be printed out for you. I'm going to say 2 short questions for Dr. Kannaneh, and then we'll open up for 1 or 2 questions again for all 3 speakers. Any questions for Dr. Kannaneh first? I'm going to say, do you see a prospect of dialogue to help resolve some of these inequities?
Do you hear me?
Yes?
Yeah, I hear an echo, so it is difficult for me to continue, but I'll try, okay? I mean, we are now talking about politics of it. But I have a word to say before I start answering your question. I feel so bad that I cannot be with you because I'm losing much of the significant contact and person-to-person contact, and to shake hands with everybody, and to give a warm hug from my heart to Setsuko. But let's hope that the next time we'll be together. Now back to your question. I'll try to answer it, and now the quality of the audio contact is better. I don't hear that resounding echo again. Okay. There is a fairly recent and but rather rapidly increasing group on the left of the Israeli society, but the real few leftists who are willing to consider a one-state solution whereby all Palestinians west of the Jordan River and all Jewish citizens of Israel west of the Jordan River would come under the same set of laws. And under such idealistic situation, which is, if it will happen probably in the time of my grandchildren or their children. Only under such conditions would there possibly be some kind of correction of this ongoing separation of the two sets of citizens of Israel. I'm sorry to say I don't expect it to change, but at least I expect and hope that some sanity, again, we are talking politics, yeah? Some sanity will prevail in terms of the political leadership in Israel, even if not a shift totally to the left that will allow equality, perfect equality, at least stop to this crazy new, I have no other word to say except ultra-rightist, fascist style of dealing with the political issues of the country. Sorry I went on a tangent, but your question was required.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, we've got 3 or 4 minutes left. Are there questions from any of our 3 speakers at the moment? You're all overwhelmed. I'm Nancy?
Yes, I wanted to ask a question to you, Rachel. How did you get invited into those countries to do the work you did?
It's interesting, it's always around the issue of disability. The official door is usually physical disabilities. And then we look at the often post-traumatic shock. And then, although it's not the official mandate, we move into the rebuilding of civil society. But really, from the funding agencies, it's never the rebuilding of civil society. We kind of tag it on.
Anybody else?
smart thing to do.
Well, I'm going to conclude by thanking all three speakers for amazing presentations and encourage you all in the great spirit of hopefulness that by and large you've heard today from people who've lived through horrors. And I think there is, if I may speak a little bit about the ICANN campaign and the follow-up of the NARET conference, there is something that I think we can all do, and that is write to our Prime Minister and Foreign Minister and commend them for at least going to the conference, but tell them they really could offer more encouragement, and that there's no reason why they can't sign on to a ban on nuclear weapons, as well as using the step-by-step process which they're so addicted to. That's, and the other thing is, encourage and greet your own Red Cross, Red Crescent societies who really sparked this new surge in emphasis on the humanitarian aspect of nuclear weapons with their resolution in 2011 calling for a ban on nuclear weapons. So if we work with them, and Rotary is going to be working also on this issue, so I think there's some great hopeful signs for a new movement. So I've taken probably more than the chair's prerogative, but I had put in my 2 cents there. So thank you all for coming, and enjoy dinner, and thank you again to the speakers.
Yes, yes, that's right, yes.
Thanks, that was wonderful, both of you. Yeah, it was great, thank you.
And you speak beautiful French, I didn't know that.
Yeah, surprised me.
Just wanted to make sure before you left.
Thank you.
You're staying yourself.
Thank you.
Bien mieux que ça. She's very modest, but she speaks excellent French. Ça me fait plaisir. No?
I don't have a question for you in Japanese.
That's all right. Oh, what's this?
Genki desu ka?
Oh, genki desu ka, good for you.
Yes.
Oh, what's this? Beautiful.
No, it's a scarf, an Indian scarf.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah. Beautiful color.
There's a little bracelet in there. Be there. Thanks.
Oh. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so just to remind people, we have to vacate the room from 5 till 6. We have other events for the evening beginning just after